Hey there, so this is Red Menace, this is Alyson, and I'm here with Breht, and it is another month where we are doing a theory-based episode. So, as you know, if you're familiar with our show at all, we do two things. On some of our episodes, we jump sort of into theoretical texts, we try to explain them in a way that it's going to be easy for people to understand, and then show why they're applicable to our current situation. And then, alternating every other month, we also do current events. We've actually done a little bit of theory back-to-back here, because we did our political economy episode last month, but for this month we wanted to jump into like a single text and really focus in on that. So we are going to be doing that today, and hopefully you will find this helpful. The text that we're going to be looking at is Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement by Anuradha Ghandy, and I think there's a lot of really valuable stuff here, so we're going to go ahead and just dive right into that. So first, we wanted to start off with why exactly this text matters. What's important about it? Why is it something that we have chosen to cover? So, Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement is the text we're working with, and it was largely compiled from the notes of Anuradha Ghandy and published posthumously by the Communist Party of India, Maoist. So the text kind of is broadly a history of the development of feminism, largely in the West, as well as an attempt to analyze and sort of categorize the various strains within feminism. So Gandhi not only explains the historical development and sort of the class base of these various strains of feminism, but also sort of critiques their weaknesses and points towards a more Marxist understanding of women's oppression. The text is often referred to as one of the key texts of proletarian feminism, which is the sort of form of feminism often espoused and endorsed by Maoists. While the text is primarily focused on critiquing other strains of feminism, we maybe potentially kind of infer some of the principles of proletarian feminism from the text by kind of understanding the perspective that Gandhi criticizes other tendencies from. So Anuradha Ghandy herself was a revolutionary who grew up in a communist household and went on to found the Communist Party of India Marxist-Leninist after having familiarized herself with the Naxalite movement. Throughout the 90s, she lived in hiding as a clandestine revolutionary, living in the forest for a long period of time while suffering from several physical ailments that made that quite difficult for her. And she would very importantly later go on to be one of the founders of the CPI Maoist shortly before her death in 2008. So for me, at least, this text is interesting because it contradicts a lot of feminist theory that I've been interested in, that I've promoted, and that is popular within Marxism on the whole. I think the text really helps clarify a lot of the flaws with sort of more bourgeois approaches to feminism, and the ways that, some feminist ideas can sound rather progressive, but still have a liberal or reactionary base to them, and it really points the way towards the need for a truly proletarian feminism. So hopefully we can get into what that looks like through this text.
Gandhi begins her analysis with a robust overview of the women's movement in the West, tracing its major lines of development out of its origins in the 19th century. She argues that the movement can be divided into two major phases, the first of which began in the mid-1800s and lasted until roughly the 1920s, and the second began in the 1960s and is still developing to this day. She is also clear that the women's movement arose in the context of capitalism and the democratic ideology rooted in the Enlightenment that blossomed simultaneous to it. More specifically, she links the rise of the women's movement to the abolitionist movement here in the U.S., both of which express democratic and egalitarian ideals from different viewpoints. The abolitionist movement against slavery in the 1830s and 40s included a large segment of educated women who later became active leaders in the struggle for women's rights. It's important to understand these historical struggles as connected and evolving instead of static and separate. In fact, it was contradictions within the abolitionist movement relating to the role women played in the movement and its leadership that led many of these women to analyze their own status in society. Out of this ferment, women's rights organizations in the United States began to sprout up around the country. Soon thereafter, the Seneca Falls Convention was established in 1848 by leaders of the women's rights movement in the U.S. In this groundbreaking feminist convention, they drafted up a Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, in which they demanded, among other things, equal wages, the right to vote, and the right to own property. The opening lines thundered, "All men and women are created equal." For 2 decades after this convention, feminist agitation, organization, political education, pamphleteering, and petition drives sprang up around the United States. In 1868, 20 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, the 14th Amendment was passed, formally granting voting rights to black men, but still not to women. At this same time, the working class movement was growing, though women were still excluded from the emerging trade unions. In fact, only the IWW supported efforts to organize women workers who worked incredibly long hours for desperately low wages. Anarchist and socialist radicals like Emma Goldman, Mother Jones, and Sojourner Truth worked and organized in this context, trying to unite the feminist movement and the workers' movement. By the turn of the 20th century, a working-class women's movement did begin to develop quite strongly. In 1909, for example, over 40,000 women garment workers went on strike in the United States. In Europe, socialists like Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, Clara Zetkin, and Alexandra Kollontai were leading the struggle to organize working women. Back in the States, though, the women's movement became increasingly focused on leveraging their advancements thus far toward getting the vote. While women did eventually achieve the right to vote in 1920, the hyper-focus on it often came to the detriment of connecting that struggle up with wider range of social and political issues. Moreover, the women's movement was still largely led by liberal, white, middle-class women, and thus often emphasized and reflected the needs and goals of white middle-class women. It was the socialist and communist women in the lower ranks of society who continued to try and take the struggle further, linking it up with the proletarian struggle more broadly and further splitting the rising feminist movement into liberal and radical camps. During the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the World Wars, there was an interregnum of sorts in the women's movement, as American and European societies focused on the intense conflicts and crises. Following World War II, with much of Europe in ruins, America faced an economic boom that saw women encouraged to give up their jobs, many of which were obtained during the war years, and return to the home, since middle-class white families could be raised comfortably at this time on a man's income alone. However, this period of time was bound to end, and by the 1960s, the second phase of the women's movement, along with a plethora of other liberation-based movements, exploded onto the scene. On university campuses, students became increasingly engaged in a whole host of social and political struggles. Books like The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir and The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan burst onto the scene alongside progressive and radical organizations like the National Organization for Women, Students for a Democratic Society, SNCC, and the Women's Radical Action Project. Radical and socialist feminist organizations began to raise debates within or break off entirely from larger multi-issue organizations to demand a focus on women's liberation, an end to patriarchy, and an identification of male supremacy as a pillar of capitalism and imperialism. While many of these movements had limitations from a Marxist perspective, they signaled a new era in the struggle for women's rights and brought these issues out into the open, forcing all of society to contend with them in new and direct ways. In the 60s and 70s across the United States and Europe, feminist movements grew along different lines, challenged one another, and engaged in key Marxist concepts like labor, reproduction, and anti-imperialism. However, in 1975, there was a noticeable shift in Western feminism away from this sort of systematic analysis and toward what Gandhi deems cultural feminism. Gandhi says, quote, "Cultural feminism begins with the assumption that men and women are basically different. It focused on the cultural features of patriarchal oppression and primarily aimed for reforms in these areas. Unlike radical and socialist feminism, it adamantly rejects any critique of capitalism and emphasizes patriarchy as the root cause of women's oppression." End quote. However, alongside this shift toward cultural feminism in the West arose an explosion of feminist movements around the world, being increasingly articulated in new ways by voices hitherto ignored or otherwise silenced. Along with these developments also came a reactionary backlash. Gandhi says, quote, "In the late 1970s and 1980s, lesbian feminism emerged as a current within the feminist movement. At the same time, women of color raised criticisms regarding the more mainstream feminist movement and began to articulate their versions of feminism. Organizations among working-class women for equal treatment at the workplace, universal child care, etc. also started blossoming. The fact that the feminist movement had been thus far mostly restricted to white, middle-class, educated women in advanced capitalist countries, and therefore was over-focusing on issues primarily of their concern, had become obvious. This gave rise to a global or multicultural feminism. Gandhi continues, "In the global South, women's groups became active, but the issues they focused on were not necessarily purely women's issues. Violence against women was a major issue, particularly sexual assault, but alongside that there was a focus on issues that revolved around colonialism and neocolonialism, poverty and exploitation by landlords, peasant issues, displacement, apartheid, and many other such problems that were important in their own countries. Overall, the feminist perspective spread around the world, and countless activist groups engaged in social and cultural projects at the grassroots level grew and continued to be active. Women's studies, too, spread widely." End quote. In the 1990s, sizable elements of the feminist movement in the West became increasingly sequestered into the academic realm. Feminism has become more an idea than a movement, and one that lacked the visionary quality it once had, wrote Barbara Epstein in 2001. At the same time, the 90s also saw an increasing gap between the economic conditions of working class and oppressed minorities and the better-off middle classes. It saw continuing inequality on multiple fronts, increasing violence on women, the onslaught of globalization, intensified attacks on the environment and indigenous communities, etc. This inevitably led to a renewed interest in Marxism, particularly by women in the global South. And with that robust yet succinct overview of the historical development of the feminist movement, initially in the West and then around the globe, Gandhi moves into an analysis of the main theoretical trends within the feminist movement. She begins this analysis by focusing on liberal feminism. Liberal feminism can be traced all the way back to the 1700s with thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, and into the 1800s with thinkers like Harriet Taylor Mill and Elizabeth Stanton. Their arguments for women's rights were based on the emergence of liberal political and philosophical thinking at that time. The ostensible core liberal values of freedom, equality, and individualism lent themselves perfectly to a liberal feminist critique. Importantly, Gandhi points out how these ideas emerged out of the development of the new capitalist mode of production and in opposition to feudal patriarchal values rooted in unjust hierarchies and brutal, unchanging inequality. Liberalism, including liberal feminism, was the philosophy of the rising bourgeoisie, and the women who advanced liberal feminism during this early era were, without exception, bourgeois women who had privileged access to the intellectual circles of their time. Here, Gandhi retraces the development of liberal feminist thought through the movements, organizations, and thinkers highlighted above, and follows its development through the 60s until today. Having traced out that history, Gandhi levels a systematic critique against liberal feminism. She argues that liberal feminism then and now focuses on individual rights over collective rights, overemphasizes the demands and interests of women in the middle and upper classes, has no class critique and is therefore reformist in nature, believes in the liberal delusion that the state is neutral and not a mechanism of class rule, has no critique of capitalism or imperialism, and is structurally unable to mobilize mass movements of women. In fact, Gandhi asserts that liberal feminism is inherently afraid of the mass mobilization of poor women and women in the global South. This sort of liberal feminism is obvious today in the form of mere representational politics and incremental reformism, and is manifested most clearly in people like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. Gandhi ends this section with the following argument. Quote, "The question of class differences and the effect of class differences on opportunities available to people was not taken into consideration by liberal feminists. Initially, liberalism played a progressive role in breaking down the feudal social and political institutions. But in the 19th century, after the growth of the working class and its movements, the limitations of liberal thinking became increasingly clear. The bourgeoisie that had so recently come to power did not extend the rights it professed to believe in to the poor and other oppressed groups. Such groups, therefore, had to struggle enormously for extended periods of time just to secure the basic rights that liberalism proclaimed to offer to everyone. However, as working-class ideologies emerged, various versions of socialism found support among the active sections of the working class. They began to question the foundations of the bourgeois order and to critique the intrinsic limitations of liberal ideology with its supposed emphasis on formal equality and individual freedom. In this phase, Ghandy says, liberalism lost its progressive role, and the mainstream feminist organizations in the West had a noticeably narrow aim.
So now that Ghandy has explored kind of the history of the feminist movement as well as liberal feminism, she turns to the trend of radical feminism. She explains that radical feminism, it was a current within feminism which largely emerged out of the 1960s and that can in some ways be understood in contrast to liberal feminism. She writes that, quote, "In contrast to the pragmatic approach taken by liberal feminism, radical feminism aims to reshape society and restructure its institutions, which they saw as inherently patriarchal. Providing the core theory for modern feminism, radicals argued that women's subservient role in society was too closely woven into the social fabric to be unraveled without a revolutionary revamping of society itself. They strove to supplant hierarchical and traditional power relationships, which they saw as reflecting a male bias with non-traditional and anti-authoritarian approaches to politics and organization," end quote. So historically, radical feminism, it emerged within a broader left-wing movement that was happening at the time. Radical feminists, in many ways, were part of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and also the emerging New Left movement. And to a large degree, the early debates within radical feminism were largely debates between organizers who had some level of commitment to Marxism or anti-capitalism or radicalism in some way. The question that spurred their original inquiry was how to properly account for the exploitation and oppression of women in particular, right? This is what they're trying to wrestle with. As the ideas of the radical feminist movement were further developed and clarified, they kind of began to abandon Marxism. Radical feminist thinkers continued to draw on certain Marxist ideas and methods, but they no longer understood their theory as a debate within a broader anti-capitalist movement, and they instead began focusing on the specificity of women's oppression above all else. So the main and sometimes only question that they really wrestled with was the question of the root of women's oppression. So Ghandy points to the works of Kate Millett as sort of a paradigmatic example of this early radical feminism. In Millett's book, Sexual Politics, she sought to sort of understand the power differentials and struggles at play in the relationships between men and women. Millett was very particularly focused on demonstrating that even personal and intimate relationships between men and women were characterized by power, and they were therefore political. And it was Millett who really actually helped popularize the phrase, the personal is political, in order to demonstrate this point. You've heard this phrase almost certainly. This, concept has been somewhat sapped of its original meaning due to its popularization and use outside of its theoretical context. But Ghandy tries to clarify its meaning for us somewhat, writing that, quote, "By the personal is political, what she meant was that the discontent individual women feel in their lives is not due to individual failings, but due to the social system, which has kept women in subordination and oppresses her in so many ways. Her personal feelings are therefore political," end quote. And that is a somewhat more structural, systemic understanding of the phrase than what we often hear. So, while Millett's notion of politics is useful for demonstrating the extent to which politics is enmeshed in all parts of human life, Ghandy argues that she also makes the error of kind of reversing historical materialism in a really problematic manner. Millett displaces the centrality of class in favor of developing a theory of social caste, which places the struggle between men and women at the center of all other contradictions and at the center of historical struggle. For Millett, patriarchy is the primary form of oppression. It has its own logic, and it's the source which produces other forms of oppression. So having placed patriarchy as sort of the theoretical core of her analysis of history and society, Millett attempts to theorize the conditions which could overcome patriarchy. And Ghandy summarizes this, writing, quote, "According to her, to eliminate patriarchy, men and women must eliminate gender, i.e. sexual status, role, and temperament, as well as they have been constructed under patriarchy. Patriarchal ideology exaggerates the biological differences between men and women and subordinates women. Millett advocated a new society, which would not be based on the sex-gender system in which men and women are equal." So getting rid of sort of gendered difference as it's produced socially and all the tropes and stereotypes and ideas that come along with that was sort of the central idea here. And this project, on the surface level, it sounds quite radical, but in practice it wasn't so much. Millett's general orientation towards political struggle was rather gradualist, actually. For Millett, the struggle didn't look like a revolution to overthrow patriarchal society, but it was a gradual and slow correcting of men's arrogance and women's obedience and the ways that we are conditioned into gendered difference. So Ghandy also looks at the work of influential radical feminist Shula Smith Firestone, in addition to Millett's work. Firestone wrote a very, very influential work called The Dialectics of Sex. Firestone took her analysis even further, in many ways, in her attempt to find the roots of women's oppression, arguing that biological reproductive role of women was the root of women's oppression. Similarly to Millett, Firestone kind of reworked historical materialism by orienting it towards the question of sex, and Ghandy summarizes this, writing, quote, "Historical materialism is that view of the course of history which seeks the ultimate cause and the great moving power of all historical events in the dialectic of sex. The division of society into two distinctly biological classes for procreative reproduction, and the struggle of these classes with one another. In the changes in the mode of marriage, reproduction, childcare created by these struggles, and the connected development of other physically differentiated classes or castes, and in the first division of labor based on sex, which developed into the economic and cultural class system." End quote. So let's do some summary work here. So Firestone thus not only centered sex as a substitute for class, but also focused on reproduction in place of production. Ghandy is careful to point out that Firestone's theory did not provide a social explanation for women's oppression, in which, we might say that oppression emerges from certain social arrangements that could be combated, but rather located oppression within the biology of womanhood itself, in reproduction understood biologically. So as a result of this, Firestone went further than Millett in her solution. While she agreed with the need to eliminate sex and gender differences through kind of cultural struggle, she also argued that this could not be accomplished without the development of artificial human reproduction, which could make biological reproduction unnecessary. She argued that if this biological basis for patriarchy were eliminated, then the social components of sex and gender difference would also be eliminated. So you have to make the reproductive role that women play unnecessary through artificial reproduction to get rid of patriarchy. On the surface level, these ideas sound very, very radical. The radical feminists, they saw themselves as revolutionaries demanding a total overhaul of society. But in practice, this isn't really what radical feminism accomplished, nor does it really reflect the praxis that they developed. Unfortunately, by separating women's oppression off from other struggles and by asserting its absolute primacy, by failing to consider how it might be shaped by other oppressions or exploitations, radical feminists undermine their own ability to create radical and systemic change. Ghandy argues that this somewhat myopic view of women's oppression is based on a very specific theory of the sex-gender system and of patriarchy, which she analyzes and critiques some. She paraphrases the work of Gail Rubin, an important radical feminist, in order to summarize this view, writing, quote, "The sex-gender system is a set of arrangements by which a society transforms the biological sexuality into products of human activity. This means that patriarchal society uses certain facts about male and female physiology, sex, as the basis for constructing a set of masculine and feminine identities and behavior, gender, that serves to empower men and disempower women. That is, how a man would be and how a woman should be. This, according to them, is the ideological basis of women's subordination. Society is somehow convinced that these culturally determined behavior traits are natural. Therefore, they said that normal behavior depends on one's ability to display the gender identities and behavior that society links with one's biological sex." End quote. So, this is kind of the view of what the problem is, right? This is the system that they're trying to combat. And this view led to specific forms of advocacy from radical feminists. While beliefs within the broader milieu were quite diverse, many argued in favor of a sort of lifestyle of androgyny, in which aspects of traditional femininity were abandoned, certain aspects of masculinity were adopted. And this sort of lifestyle-focused orientation was really, really built around trying to disrupt these gender norms, right? And this orientation also led to the idea that women ought to live lives that were oriented around other women specifically and in particular, with lesbian feminists going so far as to advocate lesbianism actually as a form of feminist praxis by which women could relate specifically to each other. So this more lifestyle-oriented form of radical feminism became known as cultural feminism. Gandhi explains the term, writing that, quote, "They are completely concentrating on the culture of society. They are not relating culture to the political economic structure of society," end quote. So in short, as cultural feminism began to develop, the focus shifted from trying to create political or economic change to trying to create cultural change. And cultural feminism developed its own approach to sexuality that created some divisions within radical feminism over what sort of the proper attitude towards sex and sexuality was. Sometimes we call this like the feminist sex wars, where sex positivity and sex negativity as concepts began to develop. So some radical feminists became very focused on pushing back against sort of conservative Christian attitudes that dominated in North America, arguing that repression of sexuality was a force which needed to be combated. Radical feminists largely agreed that sexuality was kind of a site dominated by men in which political power was at play. So radical feminists who fell outside the cultural feminist camp largely understood this as a simple matter of repression which needed to be overcome through some form of sexual liberation. So Gail Rubin, who we previously mentioned, would be an example of someone who fell into this camp. Cultural feminists, on the other hand, focused on sex as a site of sexual commodification, wherein women were dominated by men. They also developed this notion of compulsory heterosexuality to understand this domination. This later group didn't see sexual liberalism or libertine attitudes towards sex as a solution to the problem, and they instead advocated for lesbianism and expressing skepticism towards heterosexual sex, regardless of how supposedly liberated it was. And the second camp would include thinkers like Adrienne Rich as an example. This divide can largely be understood as those who believe that sex must be liberated and set free from rules and repression, and those who saw sex as a site of struggle and opposed more libertine sexual values as actually somewhat reactionary and based on male dominance. Gandhi herself is more critical of the sexual liberationist trend, arguing that their simplistic understanding of sexuality led them to develop reactionary positions. She writes, quote, "In fact, the solutions which they are promoting make an intimate human relationship into a commodity type of impersonal relationship. From here, it is one step to support pornography and prostitution. While cultural feminists strongly opposed pornography, the radicals did not agree that pornography had any adverse effect on the way men viewed women. Instead, they believed that pornography could be used to overcome sexual repression," end quote. So that kind of is the divide that ends up emerging over the view of sexuality. And Gandhi herself is more sympathetic to the cultural feminist side, pointing out that the libertine attitude towards sexuality, pornography, and sex work often justified things like sex tourism that were highly exploitative towards women in the global south, and she argues that this led to a largely reactionary view of sexuality that was problematic. So, finally, after a lot of summary work, Gandhi concludes her exploration of radical feminism with a section that's really devoted to criticizing the trend. So she first criticizes radical feminism for being really profoundly ahistorical. She argues that the attempt to supplant production with reproduction as the site of oppression and exploitation is ahistorical because of the fact that there are historical societies in which women's reproductive role was celebrated and not used to justify oppression. So the fact that women perform reproductive labor in some contexts and men perform productive labor for her doesn't necessarily imply a hierarchy. She writes, quote, "For in all the thousands of years that people lived in the first stages of human existence, women were not subordinated to men. In fact, her reproductive role was celebrated and given importance because the survival of the species and the group depended on reproduction. The importance given to fertility and the fertility rituals surviving in most tribal societies are testimony to this fact," end quote. So, this kind of view that the radical feminists put forward, she contrasts with a Marxist view, which understands the root of women's oppression in specific material conditions. It's not cultural, but it's material. She writes, quote, "The significant change in material conditions came with the generation of considerable surplus production. How this surplus would be distributed is the point at which classes arose, the surplus being appropriated by a small number of leading people in the community. Her role in reproduction, the cause of her elevated status earlier, became a means of her enslavement. Which clan, extended family, the children she bore belonged to, became important, and it is then that we find restrictions on her and the emergence of the patriarchal family in which the woman was subordinated, and her main role in society was begetting children for the family." family, end quote. So, to kind of summarize what's happening in these two quotes, what Gandhi suggests is that we can't understand women's oppression as coming from the fact that women performed a reproductive role within the society. This is the view that Firestone put forward, of course. Because she says historically there have been societies where women were largely equal with men and their reproductive role was celebrated. It was in fact a material change, the development of surplus value and then the distribution of that surplus value that created the condition for women's oppression. So the conditions of women's oppression are not found in women's biological reproduction, but are rather found in specific historical material relations that develop. Gandhi also criticizes radical feminism for being, what she sees as fundamentally reformist. Both the cultural feminists and sexual liberationist iterations fell into the same trap of trying to create small-scale cultural change in the face of what were ultimately structural economic and political problems. The former focused on separatism and building new forms of living, which separated them from the masses of women, while the latter focused on sexual liberation, while ignoring sexual domination that women have faced as a result of sexual commodification. Cultural feminists also fell into a form of biological essentialism and determinism that Gandhi is worried about. By rooting the problem within women's own biology rather than the specific material conditions, they rendered the problem of women's oppression innate to women and men themselves. Some cultural feminists even focused on embracing traditional stereotypes of women as a result of this determinism, but this led to a reactionary embrace of traditional views of women as peaceful, caring, nurturing, and it left patriarchal ideologies and assumptions about gender and women unchallenged. Finally, the politics of radical feminism also became separated from the experiences of women around the world. Their focus was largely on the experience of white middle-class women in the global north who could afford to engage in cultural and non-militant pacifist struggles. Gandhi argues in opposition to these political positions that women need militancy and they even need violence to struggle against imperialism, and that the masses of women globally have already understood the necessity of real struggle over cultural struggle. And it's here that she sort of wraps up her critique of materialist feminism. We'll go over to you now, Breht.
After a robust analysis of radical feminism, Gandhi moves into an analysis of what she considers a subsect of, or at least a strain closely related to, radical feminism, Anarcha-feminism. She begins by arguing that anarchism has had a large impact on feminism, and then dives into an overview of basic anarchist ideas, such as the idea that all states are inherently authoritarian, that private property is tyrannical, and that hierarchy is intrinsically corrosive and must be rejected in all of its forms. She rightfully highlights Emma Goldman as a foundational anarcho-feminist thinker and organizer that is still very influential for anarcho-feminists to this day. Gandhi openly admits that there is no singular vision of anarchism, but that anarchists in general share some basic principles, such as a criticism of existing society based on relations of power and domination, a vision of a radically egalitarian and horizontalist society, equipped with various claims regarding how such a society could be organized, and a general set of strategies that could take society from where it currently is toward the anarchist ideal. Gandhi also emphasizes the anarchist commitment to what we would call prefigurative politics, the idea that current forms of organization should reflect, as much as is possible, the ideal society towards which they strive. Anarchists are critical of Marxists specifically on this point, as organizing structures like the Vanguard Party are at fundamental odds with anarchist commitments. Another important aspect of anarchism in general is that their critique of society is primarily focused on a critique of hierarchy and domination, out of which a critique of classes and exploitation can be derived. For anarchists, Gandhi asserts, hierarchical social structures are seen as the ultimate roots of domination and subordination in society. Having laid out this basic and general account of anarchism, and thus of anarcho-feminism, Gandhi lays out her critique, asserting the following, quote, "But the functioning of such groups in practice, the hidden and sometimes tyrannical leadership that gets created, has led to many criticisms. The problems encountered include hidden leadership, having leaders imposed by the media, overrepresentation of middle-class women with lots of time on their hands, a lack of task groups which women could join, and in some cases, outright hostility towards women who show a natural interest in leadership. When communists raise the question that the centralized bourgeois state controlled by the imperialists needs to be overthrown, Many anarchists are simply not willing to accept the need for a centralized revolutionary organization to overthrow the state. From their analysis, it is clear that they differ strongly from the revolutionary perspective. They do not believe in the overthrow of the imperialist state as the central concern. Instead, they often prefer to spend their energy in forming small groups involved in cooperative activities or taking over small territories instead of challenging global imperialism. Gandhi continues, "In the era of monopoly capitalism, it is an illusion to think that such activities can expand and grow and gradually engulf the entire society. They will only be tolerated in a society like the United States as an oddity, an exotic plant, not a real material threat." End quote. Now let me make one point before moving on to ecofeminism, and that is to remind people that this is a general survey of general feminist traditions, and as such it cannot be exhaustive. With a movement as broad as anarchism, such a brief overview will no doubt raise objections by anarchists themselves, and some points may not apply to certain groups or sub-traditions within anarchism. For example, there are no doubt anarchist groups and movements that do not show hostility toward women who show interest in leadership, however defined, while there is, without a doubt, anarchist groups and movements that have. One interesting point Gandhi makes that could be made clear by a reference to contemporary anarchism is her critique of their lack of formal leadership, leading to media narratives that they can't control. Anti-fascist and anarchist organizations in the United States do suffer from this problem. Given their lack of leadership and coherent critique or demands, the media can shape them into whatever caricatures that they want to, and both the liberal and conservative media do just that. Think of how Antifa in Portland, for example, is so easily demonized and caricatured by the right-wing news media. They are never portrayed as having a coherent critique of existing society or even as having an historically informed critique of fascism. Since nobody speaks for such a group, its enemies can speak for them, making tens of millions of Americans hate and fear them without understanding them. There are, however, obvious benefits to these structures. For example, decentralized, leaderless organizations can't be dealt with as easily by state repression. On the other hand, almost anyone the state or the far right wants to target can be labeled as Antifa and attacked as such. It's also of interest to compare anarchist-led Antifa groups to a Marxist vanguard party like the Black Panther Party. For all the weaknesses of having known leaders that can be targeted that comes with such organization, they did have the benefit of being able to clearly convey what they stood for, what they believed in, what their critiques of society were, and what positive programs they built for their communities. They defined themselves, as opposed to allowing others to define them. And their self-definition stands the test of time, while the grotesque portrayal of them by their enemies simply doesn't. Instead of getting defensive at these portrayals, it's much more constructive to use this as an opportunity to think critically and clearly about the pros and cons of different forms of organizations and how those structures emerge from underlying principles and beliefs. It's my personal contention that both Marxist and anarchist forms of organizing have a role to play in a broader movement, so accepting one form need not come at the definite exclusion or dismissal of the other. But I digress. With that said, let's move on to Gandhi's analysis of ecofeminism. Gandhi opens this section by arguing that ecofeminism has close links with cultural feminism, though ecofeminists do distinguish themselves in various ways. Cultural feminists have historically identified women with nature in art, music, and communes, framing women and nature as one force against male-dominated human culture. Ecofeminists, in turn, often recognize the important emphasis on class and economics that socialist feminism advances, but critique socialists for ignoring or not sufficiently addressing the question of domination in nature. If anarcha-feminism centers its analysis on power, hierarchy, and domination, and socialist feminism centers their analysis on class repression, social reproduction, and economic domination, ecofeminists center their analysis on the domination of nature, on non-human animals, and on the destruction of the natural environment. Within ecofeminism, there are various strains, one of which is spiritualism, which focuses on the mystical relationship to nature, another of which is more worldly, focusing on active intervention to stop destructive and extractive practices that brutalize natural habitats and ecodiversity. Social constructivist ecofeminists argue for the dissolution of the dichotomy between nature and human culture, and between men as representations of culture and women as representations of nature, arguing for a holistic oneness where the dichotomy is resolved through the unity of these opposites. Whatever the strain of ecofeminism may be, there is often a tendency, Gandhi claims, to want to retreat to a pre-industrial past and to be skeptical of Western science and technology overall. In effect, some ecofeminists end up glorifying a patriarchal, pre-capitalist subsistence economy. This form of culturalism and postmodernism, which tends to oppose development and romanticize a long-dead past, can end up being fairly reactionary in its vision. Gandhi says it is important to oppose the destructive, extractive practices forced onto people around the world in the name of profit and imperialism, but this should not lead us to be against the application of science to improve, say, agricultural production. It's the capitalist class society and its social relations that subordinates otherwise important scientific and technological progress to its imperial and profit-hungry demands. The goal should be to bring these advancements under democratic control within a socialist mode of production, not to reject them wholesale as part and parcel with capitalism and imperialism, and then retreat into an idealized pre-industrial past that doesn't and cannot exist. In short, Gandhi urges us to move forward, not backward, and locates the solutions to many of the problems that ecofeminism fairly points out in a socialist future, not a pre-capitalist past.
So, moving forward, the next section that we have to look at is Gandhi's section on socialist feminism, where she kind of tries to raise a critique here. So the socialist feminists emerged from sort of the same broader left-wing struggles that the radical feminists did. Gandhi explains the difference, writing, quote, "Though they were critical of the socialists and communists for ignoring women's questions, unlike the radical feminist trend, they did not break with the socialist movement, but concentrated their efforts on combining Marxism with radical feminist ideas. There's a wide spectrum amongst them as well," end quote. So here, Gandhi is very focused on pointing out that there's disagreement within the socialist feminist camp, and she spends some time analyzing a few of the trends within it. So one trend among the socialist feminists is sort of the Marxist feminist trend, which seeks to incorporate feminist insight into a broader Marxist framework. So these feminists focused largely on domestic work and sought to develop a Marxist understanding of this work. They argued that domestic work produces a commodity, the laborer who's able to go forth and labor as a result of the domestic work that is done. They therefore insist that domestic work has not only the production of use value, but also of exchange value, as it produces labor power itself as a thing to be exchanged. These feminists largely signed on to demands for compensation for domestic labor, though these demands lost steam as more and more women became part of the official workforce. Marxist feminists also kind of responded to this incorporation of women into the workforce by turning their attention to discrimination against women within the workplace, analyzing the experiences of women as proletarians in particular. Gandhi addresses the ideas of Heidi Hartman in particular as kind of an example of Marxist feminism. Hartman wrote The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism Towards a More Progressive Union, and this text turned out to be quite influential. Hartman argues that Marxism and feminism are intertwined in a complex relationship, due to their historical development and overlap with each other, in which Marxism has been the dominant form of analysis. Gandhi summarizes her perspective for us, writing, quote, "According to her, while Marxism provides an analysis of historical development and of capital, it does not analyze the relations of men and women. She says that the relations between men and women are also determined by a system which is patriarchal, which feminists have analyzed. Both historical materialist analysis of Marxism and patriarchy as a historical and social structure are necessary to understand the development of Western capitalist society and the position of women within it, to understand how relations between men and women have created and how patriarchy has shaped the course of capitalism." She is critical of Marxism on the women's question. She says that Marxism has dealt with the women's question only in relation to the economic system. Even the study of housework dealt with the relation of women to capital, but not to men. Though Marxists are aware of the suffering of women, they have focused on private property and capital as the source of women's oppression. Early Marxists failed to take into account the differences in men and women's experiences of capitalism and consider patriarchy a leftover from an earlier period. End quote. So Hartman thus argued that it's not enough to understand women's place within capitalism and to understand the beneficiaries of women's oppression to be the ruling class alone. She instead argues that the gender division of labor works to benefit both the ruling class and men more broadly. So in her view, men therefore have a material interest in maintaining the exploitation of women. She also argued that the class was a gender-blind concept, which could not capture the specificity of women's experience, because when you talk about the working class, you're not talking about specific genders within it. Hartman was opposed to other socialist feminists who tried to understand women's oppression with the aid of Marxist methods. Many of these feminists sought to understand child rearing and reproduction via a Marxist lens and argued that patriarchy was an ideological component of capitalism. Hartman instead insisted that patriarchy was material as well as ideological. Gandhi again kind of summarizes this idea, writing, quote, "According to her, the material base of patriarchy is men's control over women's labor power. They control it by denying access to women over society's reproductive resources, denying her a job with a living wage, and restricting her sexuality. This control, according to her, operates not only within the family, but also outside at the workplace. At home, she serves the husband, and at work, she serves the boss. Here it is important to note that Hartman makes no distinction between men of the ruling classes and other men. Hartman concludes that there's no pure patriarchy and no pure capitalism. Production and reproduction are combined in a whole society in the way it is organized, and hence we have what she calls patriarchal capitalism." End quote. Thus, for Hartman, there's a relationship between patriarchy and capitalism which exploits women and workers. This idea comes to be referred to as two systems theory because it understands capitalism and patriarchy as two separate material systems, not one as the product of the other. So another group of socialist feminists argued against two systems theory. Among this group, there was Iris Marion Young as well as Maria Mies, whose focus primarily was on the gender division of labor, and they were trying to understand women's oppression through this. They argued that while class had the problem of being gender blind, the division of labor did not, because when we are talking about how labor is divided, you are talking about gender at the same time, since women perform reproductive labor and men perform productive labor. Gandhi tries to summarize Mies at length, writing that, quote, "Femaleness and maleness are defined in each historical epoch differently. Thus, in earlier, what she calls matristic societies, women were significant for they were productive. They were active producers of life. Under capitalist conditions, this was changed, and they are housewives, empty of all creative and productive qualities. Women as producers of children and milk, as gatherers and agriculturalists, had a relationship with nature which was different from that of men. Men related to nature through tools. Male supremacy came not from superior economic contribution, but from the fact that they invented the destructive tools through which they controlled women, nature, and other men. Further, she adds that it was the pastoral economy in which patriarchal relations were established. Men learned the role of the male in impregnation. Their monopoly over arms and this knowledge of the male role in reproduction led to changes in division of labor. Women were no longer important as gatherers of food or as producers, but their role was breeding children. Thus, she concludes that we can attribute the symmetric division of labor between men and women to this predatory mode of production, or rather appropriation, which is based on male monopoly over means of coercion, i.e. arms and direct violence, by means of which permanent relations of exploitation and dominance between the sexes was created and maintained." End quote. So again, here, there is not sort of the radical feminist view, which understands the problem of women's, oppression lying in biological reproduction, but rather in specific social relations that men developed in response to that reproductive capacity. So this is a step beyond radical feminism towards a more kind of materialist understanding. But the focus that Mies puts forward is not the Marxist focus on class, but instead a feminist focus on the division of labor as the primary source of of women's oppression. So Mies and Young thus criticized what they saw as mechanical Marxists for failing to grasp the specificity of women's oppression and failing to center this gendered division of labor in their analysis, instead focusing on the centrality of understanding class. They argued that organizing women was a socialist activity and that all socialist organizing needed to concern itself with the organizing of women as well. So, much like radical feminism, socialist feminism had both a theoretical and a practical component. Hartman, for example, argued that socialists need to work with groups that represented women's interests in particular. This, of course, presumed that women's interests and workers' interests were not identical, in line with sort of two-system theory that Hartman developed. Hartman thus rejected the idea of a vanguard party that would unite all interests of members of the progressive classes, instead arguing that independent women's organizations needed to exist with their own autonomous status outside of socialist organizations. As such, her approach supported the development of autonomous women's movement distinct from, but in coalition with, the socialist movement. More broadly, socialist feminists have supported anti-capitalist and anti-patriarchal struggles and supported coalitions with other groups. They insist that anti-capitalism is central to the opposition to patriarchy. They acknowledge that the overthrow of capitalism is a precondition for the liberation of women. They have some overlap with radical feminists in as much as they also believe in developing a distinct women's culture and developing communities and counter-institutions of women. They differ from radical feminists in as much as they recognize that these goals do not constitute revolution itself, and they recognize that they're very insufficient when they're undertaken in a capitalist context. They just choose to do them anyway. For socialist feminists, these actions are more about prefigurative politics than they are about actually challenging capitalism or patriarchy. Gandhi summarizes this by writing, quote, "In short, socialist feminists see it as a means of organizing and helping women, while radical feminists see it as a goal of completely separating from men. Socialist feminists, like radical feminists, believe that efforts to change the family structure, which is what they call the cornerstone of women's oppression, must start now. So they have been encouraging community living or some sort of midway arrangements where people try to overcome the gender division in work sharing, looking after children, where lesbian and heterosexual people can live together." End quote. So, before, turning to her critique of the socialist feminists, Gandhi notes that socialist feminists and radical feminist praxis in theory have kind of been subjected to an independent critique from black women and black feminist thinkers in general. She writes that, quote, "Both radical feminists and socialist feminists have come under strong attack from black women for essentially ignoring the situation of black women and concentrating all their analysis on the situation of white middle-class women and theorizing from it. For example, Joseph points out the condition of black slave women who were never considered feminine. In the fields and plantations, in labor and in punishment, they were treated equal to men. The black family could never stabilize under conditions of slavery, and black men were hardly in a condition to dominate women, slaves that they were. Later on, black women have had to work for a living, and many of them have also been domestic servants in rich white houses. The harassment they face, the long hours of work, make their experience very different from that of white women. Hence, they are not in agreement with the concept of the family being a source of oppression. For black women, it was a source of resistance to racism. On the dependence of women on men, black women can hardly be dependent on black men given high rates of unemployment and discrimination against them, and the reproduction in the role of women. They reproduced white labor and children through their domestic employment in white houses." End quote. So it is important to note that although Gandhi does not go more into depth in this, the black feminist tradition has been extremely critical of socialist feminism and radical feminism, and I think this is a very good summary that raises the way that the socialist feminist emphasis on reproductive labor over productive labor just absolutely ignores the experiences of black women and other colonized women. So, having outlined the theory and practice of the socialist feminists, Gandhi turns to her own criticism of the trend. So first, socialist feminism is somewhat eclectic in nature. It's an attempt to fuse aspects of radical feminism and Marxism, and in order to do so, it has to pick and choose its evidence. It falls into a myopic framework in which the experience of white women living in industrialized or post-industrialized societies are the primary source of analysis. It works out from that perspective. Gandhi explains the problem with this myopic worldview while also explaining what the proper Maoist view is, and this is very important. She states, quote, There is a tendency to universalize the experience and structure of advanced capitalist countries to the whole world. For example, in South Asia and China, which have had a long feudal period, we see that women's oppression in that period was much more severe. The Maoist perspective on the women's question in India also identifies patriarchy as an institution that has been the cause of women's oppression throughout class society. But it does not identify it as a separate system with its own laws of motion. The understanding is that patriarchy takes different content and forms in different societies, depending on their level of development and the specific history and conditions of that particular society, that it has been and is being used by the ruling class to serve their interests. Hence, there is no separate enemy for patriarchy. Let's repeat that real quick, because this is the very important core here. The Maoist perspective on the women's question in India also identifies patriarchy as an institution that has been the cause of women's oppression throughout class society, but it does not identify it as a separate system with its own laws of motion. The understanding is that patriarchy takes different content and forms in different societies, depending on their level of development and specific history and conditions of that particular society, that it has been and is being used by the ruling class to serve their interests. Hence, there is no separate enemy for patriarchy. End quote. So capitalism thus relies on patriarchy as an institution, but patriarchy is not a totally separate system with some sort of internal logic that operates independently of class society. Furthermore, patriarchy takes different forms historically and is not universally similar across historical contexts. This insight is important because it pushes back against Herman's idea that men in general might be the enemy of women. Gandhi explains that if we conclude in favor of the Maoist view, then, quote, the same ruling classes, whether imperialists, capitalists, feudalists, and the state they control, are the enemy of women because they uphold and perpetuate the patriarchal family, gender discrimination, and the patriarchal ideology within that society. End quote. This does not mean that ordinary and working class men do not support patriarchal ideology, of course. That would be an absurd claim. They frequently do, but that does not mean that they directly benefit from the oppression of women, at least not in the same way and to the same extent that the ruling class do. The socialist feminists have missed this insight by overemphasizing reproduction and underemphasizing women's role in productive labor itself. Women are increasingly a part of the labor pool, and Gandhi again notes that the experience of women as primarily reproductive laborers was actually particular to the experiences of middle-class women within the global north. The solution to women's oppression is thus not found in the elimination of the gendered division of labor. This division was never a historical universal. Again, black women were largely excluded from it, and its elimination does not ensure women's equality. Rather, women's liberation requires control over the means of production itself. Class struggle, then, not just opposition to division of labor, must be at the core of women's oppression. Gandhi insists that in contrast to the socialist feminist idea that women play an exclusively reproductive role, quote, the Marxist perspective stresses women's role in social production, and her withdrawal from playing a significant role in social production has been the basis for her subordination in class society. So we are concerned with how the division of labor, relations to the means of production, and labor itself is in particular society, is organized to understand how the ruling classes exploited women and forced their subordination. Patriarchal norms and rules help to intensify the exploitation of women and reduce the value of their labor. End quote. Socialist feminists are not only incorrect, then, in emphasizing reproduction over production as women's central role, but also in making the distinction between the base and the superstructure somewhat meaningless, by insisting that reproduction is a part of the base alongside production. They expand the concept of the base to include any relationship between men and women, and as a result, the concept of the base loses the analytical specificity that it would need to be useful. And so this is one of the big problems that Gandhi has with socialist feminism. So given these considerations, the main problem with the socialist feminists is that they have largely abandoned an analysis of class as a relation to private property. Their focus on the gender division of labor has of course been important to understanding women's position with advanced capitalist countries, but it's not a sufficient analytic to explain inequality and oppression. Gandhi again asserts that the gender division of labor has existed in societies that celebrated women's reproduction while maintaining equitable gender relations. This means that inequality and oppression are not inherent to a gender division of labor. Some other factor must explain where the oppression of women comes from. The socialist feminists, Gandhi tells us, has largely failed to find what this factor is. Gandhi therefore writes, quote, "Hence, the mere fact of gender division of labor does not explain the inequality. To assert that gender-based division of labor is the basis of women's oppression rather than class still begs the question. If we do not find some social material reason for the inequality, we are forced into accepting the argument that men have an innate drive to power and domination. Such an argument is self-defeating because it means there's no point in struggling for equality. It can never be realized. The task of bearing children by itself cannot be the reason for this inequality, for as we have said earlier, it was a role that was lauded and welcomed in primitive society. Other material reasons had to arise that vis-a-vis the cause which the radical and socialist feminists are not probing." End quote. Thus, we must insist on a properly proletarian view of feminism, which analyzes the actual factor at play, which is class as a relation to private property. Is this factor the base of capitalist society, which allows the gender division of labor to take on exploitative and oppressive dynamics? This means that the interests of women are not independent of or separate from the interests of proletarians. This means that the interests of working-class men are not inherently, because of material reasons, at odds with the interests of working-class women. Women's liberation can therefore only be achieved in the struggle against capitalism and imperialism. And it's here, at the end of Gandhi's critique of socialist feminism, that we can start to kind of see the distinctive aspects of proletarian feminism beginning to emerge. And we will now move on to looking at her next section. Breht.
The criticism of feminists from non-white women led a section of feminists to move in the direction of multiculturalism and postmodernism. Postmodernism has been very popular among academics in particular. They believe generally that no fixed categories exist, including the category of woman, and that the self is fragmented into various fluid and intersecting identities: sex, class, caste, ethnic community, race, etc. Since each identity has a value in and of itself, no significance is given to values towards which all can strive. Looked at in this way, there is no ability to find common ground for collective political activity. This kind of hyper-individualist identity reductionism divides more than it unites. Postmodernists celebrate difference and identity, and they criticize Marxism for focusing on one totality, i.e. class. Furthermore, postmodernism does not believe that language, Western languages at least, adequately reflect reality. They believe that identities are constructed through discourse. In their understanding, language constructs reality. Therefore, many of them have focused on deconstruction of language, the end result of which is that there is no material reality about which we can be certain. This is a form of extreme subjectivism. Postmodern feminists have focused on psychology and language. Postmodernists, in agreement with the famous French philosopher Michel Foucault, are against what they call relations of power. But this concept of power is diffuse and obscure and is never clearly defined. Who wields the power? According to Foucault, it is only at the local level, so resistance to power can only be local. In effect, postmodernism is extremely divisive because it promotes fragmentation between people and gives relative importance to identities without any theoretical framework to understand the historical reasons for identity formation and no way to link the various identities together in common struggle. With such an argument, logically, there can be no real organization. At best, it can only be spontaneous organization at the local level among temporary coalitions. For postmodern feminists, to advocate meaningful organization means to reproduce power, hierarchy, and therefore oppression. Essentially, they leave the individual to resist for himself or herself however they see fit, and are against consistent, organized resistance, as well as organized armed resistance. Carol Stabile, a Marxist feminist, put it well when she said, quote, "Anti-organizational bias is part and parcel of the postmodernist package. To organize any but the most provisional and spontaneous coalitions is, for postmodernists, social theorists, and feminists alike, to reproduce oppression, hierarchies, and forms of intractable dominance. The fact that capitalism is extremely organized makes little difference, because one resists against a multivalent, diffuse form of power. Nor, as Joreen pointed out over 2 decades ago, does it seem to matter that structurelessness produces its own forms of tyranny. Thus, in place of any organized politics, postmodernist social theory offers us variations on pluralism, individualism, individualized agency, and ultimately individualized solutions that have never and will never be capable of resolving structural problems." End quote. Gandhi finishes, "It is not surprising, then, that for the postmodernists, capitalism and imperialism are just one more form of power among many. While postmodernism in its developed form may not yet be found in semi-colonial societies like India quite yet, many bourgeois feminists have been influenced by it." All right, so now let's move into the questions section of the episode before we do a final application point in the outro. And we just have 2 questions today, a little back and forth, and I'll ask the first question to Alyson. Alyson, does all of this mean that feminism is inherently bourgeois? Is feminism more or less useless? And if not, how do we as Marxists relate to it?
Yeah, so I think this is something to wrestle with proletarian feminism and kind of the ideas that Gandhi puts forward here. So I think it would be easy to look at this text and see someone who is looking at all the major trends of feminism and trying to dismiss them and make a critique of them. And she is making a critique of them, but I think it's important to note that she's not dismissing them entirely, right? In the context of the vast majority of the sections of this text, while she does make very, very strong criticisms of the bourgeois nature of a lot of these movements, she also notes that there are insights that they have, right? Even some of the radical feminists, she notes, are able to make insights around questions of sexuality and politics sort of pervading human life in contexts we might not understand. And throughout the text, we do see kind of a recognition that some of this work was able to find important ideas. So to think of sort of the project here and of proletarian feminism as an outright rejection of feminism as inherently bourgeois, I think would be incorrect. It is a criticism of the bourgeois nature of the predominant trends within feminism, but it's not the same thing as a total rejection of feminism. And differentiating those 2 things, I think, is fairly important. You know, one thing that I've seen a lot in response to this text and in response to sort of the Maoist proletarian approach to feminist sort of thought is to call it class reductionist, right? That is often something that people will say in response to this to try to say that it is opposed to feminism and it is saying that feminism is not useful. And, you know, I think to wrestle with that idea of is this like a class reductionist way of not thinking about patriarchy or women's oppression, we have to ask like what a class reductionist like perspective would mean, right? And if by class reductionist we mean that the argument here is that patriarchy and women's oppression is ultimately produced by class, then sure, I guess in a sense this is a class reductionist account, right? Her claim is very, very thoroughly that class and private property are what structure women's oppression, not some other condition within capitalism or class society. But does it follow from that claim that we therefore just ignore women's oppression or ignore patriarchal social relations? And I think it's very clear from this text that that's not the case. Gandhi, over and over again, towards the end of the text, especially when she's trying to develop a more clear perspective on proletarian feminism, says that, you know, patriarchal social relations are real. The oppression and exploitation of women are real, and they are, in a sense, distinct from other forms of oppression. But it's a question of in what sense they're distinct. They're distinct in that there are specific ways that women are affected by exploitation and oppression that men generally are not. But the important claim here is that these aren't produced by a separate system with its own separate logic outside of capitalism, which we could call patriarchy. So patriarchal social relations are understood to exist. They're understood to be a problem that has to be addressed specifically. But the claim is that they need to be addressed through communist struggle, because it is class that gives patriarchal social relations its base and that produces inequality and violence against women. So the position here, I would say, is not that feminism is inherently bourgeois or that feminism is useless. It's that we need a feminism that is proletarian, as the name would imply, rather than a bourgeois feminism. And I think especially if we look at proletarian feminism sort of in practice, we can see the extent to which this isn't just an attempt to throw out feminist analysis or throw out consideration of women's oppression. If anything, in practice, proletarian feminism has been really militant about addressing women's oppression. Within the struggles within the Philippines, within the struggles in Peru and also in India, we've seen movements of women within the communist movement more broadly and within communist parties specifically focused on rejecting patriarchal social relations, male chauvinism, and combating rapists and predators within communist organizing. These have been central parts of proletarian feminism. So when people took the ideas advanced in this text and put them into practice, it didn't look like ignoring gender or ignoring, women's oppression. It looked like taking them seriously, but understanding that they have to be addressed in the context of communist struggle. So the main takeaway here that I kind of want to emphasize is that I think the takeaway from Gandhi is not that feminism is useless or that it's bourgeois. It's that feminism can't be external to communist struggle. It has to be internal to it. The vanguard party has to be the site of feminist struggle because the source of women's oppression is not in a division of labor or in the biological determinist sort of view of reproduction. It's actually, and more importantly, found in class relations itself. So this isn't a way of ignoring gender. It's not a way of saying feminism needs to be thrown away. It's a way of honing in our analysis of feminism and a strategic orientation on how to address women's oppression through communist struggle.
Yeah, exactly right. Perfectly said. And it leads, I think, well into your question that you have for me.
Totally. So, yeah, I guess the next question then would be, how does Gandhi put on a display of historical and dialectical materialist understanding of feminism?
So let's take these one at a time, and let's start with historical materialism. So Gandhi traces the emergence of the women's movement back to the development of the capitalist mode of production out of feudalism, positioning feminism as a natural and historical outgrowth initially of liberal philosophy, the very liberal philosophy that was emerging alongside capitalism. Liberal philosophy, as we know, has its roots in the Enlightenment, a period of human history where thinkers were moving away from the superstition, the static hierarchical forms, and the domination of the church that were the hallmarks of feudalism, and toward an embrace of reason, of evidence based on the senses as primary sources of knowledge, and of ideals like liberty, progress, and constitutional government. The Enlightenment itself arose out of the humanism inherent in the Renaissance and the new forms of knowledge being unleashed by the scientific revolution. Philosophers like Descartes, Kant, Locke, Rousseau, and Mill all contributed to an understanding of the world around us that bolstered and justified the emergence of liberalism and capitalism. But, as we've discussed at length in other episodes, there was always a gap between what liberalism said it stood for and how liberalism actually manifested in the world. It could be said that it's within that gap, within that discrepancy, that progressive social movements like feminism first arose, using the rhetoric and core values of liberalism to challenge its real-world structures. By making this historical development clear and by connecting liberalism's emergence to the emergence of a new mode of production, namely capitalism, Gandhi is advancing an historical materialist account of the beginnings of the feminist movement, tying it to a plethora of other co-occurring historical processes rooted ultimately in the new forms of production and social relations. This is also, of course, a display of dialectics, because Gandhi's analysis of the different strains of feminism show how they emerged from a common ancestor, if you will, and then developed along different lines that emerged out of feminism's engagement with the real world, giving rise to contradictions within the movement, disparate trends which arose out of those contradictions to challenge one another in various ways, and tying it all to developments outside of feminism itself, like the movement for the abolition of slavery and the movement for workers' rights. In this conception of feminism, any understanding of it cannot be divorced from everything else that was happening within, before, and around it. Ultimately, it advances an understanding of feminism as a historical process, formed and reformed by other, often simultaneous historical processes in constant dialectical engagement with internal and external forces. And her view also ensures that we understand feminism, as we should everything else, as a continually evolving process in which we can meaningfully engage as historically conscious subjects. In these ways, this text is not an explanation of dialectical and historical materialism, but a display of how to put dialectical and historical materialism into practice to create superior forms of understanding.
Yeah, I think that's a really great explanation, honestly. And I think the text as a display of that is so important to see, right? Because it would be easy to sort of just reduce this to like, oh, a critique of feminism. But it is more than that, right? It is teasing out the conditions that produced feminism. And to note, that feminism has had bourgeois characteristics at certain times isn't just like a dismissal, right? It's a contextualization of how feminism emerged within those historical moments. And I think thinking about that as a dialectical and historical process is sort of what's important for understanding the nuance that is here in this text.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love to come back to these things because, as we all know, these can be very challenging ideas, and to understand something abstractly is different than being able to put it into practice, and to see it being put into practice so well also helps with our abstract understanding of it as a concept. And so coming back and showing how this work touches on and relates to things that we've done on Red Menace in the past, I think hopefully lends itself toward a more robust understanding of these ideas and how they're put into practice overall. So,
absolutely.
All right. With that said, we're going to move on to application points, and it will be Alyson's application point, and then she will take us out.
So, every episode we like to do an application section where we try to make this theory hit a little bit more close to home and demonstrate that it matters in some ways. For this section, I'm going to be quite a bit candid. I think that probably the most useful way of using this application is to consider some of my own errors. So anyone who's familiar with my writing outside of this podcast and the Twitter presence that I once and thankfully no longer maintain will recognize that much of the ideas here described of socialist and radical feminism are more or less in line with the ideological positions that I was championing throughout 2018 and 2019. So under the heading of materialist feminism, I wrote many articles which tried to fuse aspects of socialist feminism with aspects of lesbian and radical feminism in order to develop a fairly eclectic view of feminism. By the end of 2018, I think that I was beginning to realize that my ideas regarding gender were somewhat at odds with my own claim to be a Marxist, and I attempted to try to reconcile these views a bit more closely. In a rather lengthy article titled On Women as a Class, Materialist Feminism, and Mass Struggle, which is available online via Cosmonaut, I tried to figure out how to reconcile these two projects. My project on the time drew on a pretty eclectic mix of theorists, though it largely depended on Monique Fatigue and Silvia Federici, to argue that while women constituted a unique class on the basis of the gender division of labor, capitalism was still the system which created this division. Therefore, I concluded that we could simultaneously uphold a socialist feminist view of women and a Marxist view of capitalism. In this sense, I was really trying to argue against dual systems theory by arguing that capitalism produced the gender division of labor. And I also tried to argue that this meant that working class women still had to maintain enmity towards bourgeois women, while also maintaining that the category of women in some way constituted a class because of the gender division of labor. And this project was really an attempt to kind of hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. So, given these rather public theoretical mistakes, I think it would be useful for me to kind of use what we've done here with Ghandy's work to understand what I got wrong and to explain why my old ideas really shouldn't be adopted by anyone advocating for either socialism or feminism. So again, if you want to go back and read that piece, it is on Cosmonaut. It's one of the last pieces that I published on the question, and I think was the most mature attempt at theory, and even then I think it's really wrong. And these 3 points that I'm going to be looking at are really in response to my writing in that piece. So, first, my writing overall, I think, really radically misunderstood what class actually is. I argued that because there's a division of labor between women and men, they are therefore totally different classes in the materialist sense of the word. And this is not a Marxist view of class at all. And it's also, aside from just not being Marxist, it's a nonsensical view of class. And I think we can see that pretty easily. So division of labor doesn't just apply to the sort of gendered division of labor between reproductive and productive labor. It's a term within Marxism that applies to the way that labor is divided under capitalism. So, for example, we can think about it historically in this way. If you were to order a pick or a shovel or something like that in a feudal society, you would be paying an artisan to basically do the entire work of creating that item. But if you want to buy a pick or a shovel on the market, you are going to order it in a context in which it was probably produced on an assembly line by a whole bunch of workers, none of whom oversaw the entire process, but each of them overseeing a individual part of the process. So the division of labor more broadly is universal to work under capitalism. Workers in an assembly line are divided to engage in different aspects of the production of a commodity, for example. One will specialize in one part of the production and another in another part. But we wouldn't use that division of labor to say that each of these workers is part of a different class on the basis of that division. That's an obviously nonsensical way of looking at things. We would instead correctly assert that they're all members of the working class. And this is because for Marxists, and really this is what I missed, class isn't defined by the division of labor, but by a relation to private property. And this is what I was sort of displacing in line with the socialist feminist view. The ruling class, according to a Marxist view, is the class which owns and controls private property, whereas the working class is the class which owns nothing but its own labor. As a result of this, class can't be understood as a result of divisions of labor, but it's actually a result of private property and the relations that are developed from private property. This was a concept that I think I completely misunderstood, leading me to insist on the extremely incorrect and actually, rather incoherent idea that women were a class in and of themselves. This was an idea that I largely got from the theorist Monique Fatigue, but I think her reasoning about the meaning of class is also largely incorrect on this question for a very similar reason. So, secondly, I made the same mistake of the socialist feminists of really trying to expand the base aspect of the base superstructure system in a way that was not helpful. So, my claim that women were a class resulted from the claim that the division of labor was as much a part of the base of capitalism as private property was. And while this didn't deny the importance of private property in an analysis of capitalism and patriarchy, it did displace its centrality, and as a result, it displaced the centrality of the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. I tried to insist that this was an alternative to the dual systems theory that says that, patriarchy and capitalism are separate things, and I really was trying to say, both of these are produced by capitalism, but women are still a class in some way. I claimed that capitalism still produced patriarchy because the gender division of labor was the part of the base of capitalism. But this betrayed a broader understanding of what capitalism is, and what constitutes the base of capitalism. While the base is more than just private property and class, the central part of capitalism, as we understand it from a Marxist perspective, is private property and the class relations that develop as a result of that. And I tried really hard to displace that and get away from that in a way that was a huge mistake, and I think really limited the utility of what I was able to write. So third, and this is one that I think is very important, I fell into the same trap of the socialist feminists of really only focusing on the experiences of largely middle-class white women in advanced capitalist countries. The entire notion that women were primarily engaged in reproductive labor wasn't actually reflective of either the global realities of women as workers across the globe, or even the American reality, wherein women are already largely integrated into productive labor forces. So my focus on kind of mid-century French theorists and 1970s French theorists caused me to really fail to interrogate whether the conditions they analyzed were actually even correct at the time I was writing for the United States or globally. And a lot of the criticism that I got was on this ground, and I should have heeded it more closely. So given those errors, it's no surprise that my work ended up trying to affirm what were fundamentally contradictory positions, and ended up being very, very myopic in its analysis. And it was rightfully criticized for this, and I took a long period of time without writing about gender in order to sort of reassess my views. And in fact, this episode is basically my first public attempt at wrestling with feminism as a system since, 2019, honestly. What I learned from my own mistake is that most important of all, to understand women's oppression we have to understand capitalism. We have to make sure that our conceptual understandings of class, the division of labor, property, revolution, all of these ideas are thorough and they're fleshed out. If we don't have that foundation built, we're not going to be able to understand other forms of oppression that emerge within class society. We also have to engage in discussion and struggle with other comrades in order to sharpen these ideas and ensure that we're developing as socialists not just through our own personal, isolated, or academic study, but through collective learning and struggle. I made the mistake of really misunderstanding all of this, and it produced some really sloppy theory as a result, and I think it's important to now recognize what those flaws were and try to warn against that. The important takeaway from my mistakes, which is a takeaway that I really hope you can learn from my mistakes rather than making these mistakes yourself, is that the struggle for women's liberation is the struggle against capitalism and imperialism. They are not separate struggles, they are the same one. Patriarchy is not an independent thing which exists across history with its own logic. It is a product of class society. And as a result of that reality, its defeat can only come from class struggle. Only the defeat of capitalism and imperialism can ever liberate women, because the root of women's oppression lies in class and private property itself. And that's really what I hope you can take away from this episode, and what I wish I had learned years ago. So that's about all I have to say on the application point for today. I hope that is somewhat helpful for people who are wrestling with these questions. And yeah, it's very nice to be back doing a theoretical text. We've taken a little bit of break from examining texts in particular, and I think this is a very important text. I hope that in addition to listening to this episode, you will go and read it, study its history, and discuss it with comrades in person or online as much as you can right now, because I think that is really an important way to learn. What we're doing here is a supplement to that, ideally. So, thank you for tuning in so much. Thank you all for continuing to listen to our podcast. It means so very much to both Breht and myself. If you are interested in hearing more, you can find us on Twitter, where we post things on @red_menace_pod. That is probably the easiest way to find us, see what we're up to. You can find us obviously on iTunes and also on Spotify, and you can also find us on Patreon, where if you are interested in supporting what we're doing, you can support us in exchange for extra episodes every month or extra content of some sort every month. That support really means a lot to us and is what gives us the ability to devote the amount of time to this podcast that we actually devote to it, and we appreciate it very, very much. So thank you all for tuning in. I really do hope this episode has been helpful. Please go out and study. Please go out and struggle and learn these things collectively. Thank you so much.